DragonSword Awakening has just arrived on Steam, and man, at the beginning I was making the dumbest mistakes you can imagine. After a long time, I learned a few things the hard way, messing up builds, wasting gold, and taking unnecessary beatings from bosses. So I put together 10 tips that I wish I had seen before I started. If you've already downloaded the game or are thinking about buying it, stick around until the end because there are tips here that can really help you out. I'm Mary, and the video is about to start. This one is, without exaggeration, one of the mechanics that changes the game the most if you master it. The switching signal is basically that moment when you swap heroes right as the enemy hits you. It sounds simple, but the timing is very tight. You have about 0.3 seconds after the hit to make the swap. If you pull it off, you gain iframes, cancel the incoming damage, and even activate the special effect of the hero tagging in. What makes this so strong isn't just the damage avoided, it's what you gain in return. Depending on the hero you bring into the fight, it could be an instant heal, a knockdown that grounds the enemy, an attack buff to turn the tables, or even a cleanse that removes debuffs. It's that feeling of, I was about to die, but I turned the tables in a split second. Of course, it takes practice. There's no point in randomly swapping heroes. It has to be at the exact right moment. I, for example, spent a good portion of the early game taking hits without understanding why the damage was landing when I saw the swap happening. It was only by paying attention to the moment of impact that it finally clicked. Today, I use the Valiant Hatchling in training just to keep repeating this until it becomes second nature. It sounds stupid, but it's just like learning to dodge at the right time in a Souls-like. Eventually, your brain just does it without you thinking. My suggestion is this: don't be in a rush to apply this to bosses right away. Train until your finger responds on its own, because in a real fight, especially against a boss with a long combo or an attack that two-shots you, that half a second makes all the difference between surviving or returning to the last save point. It's annoying at first, but once it gets into muscle memory, you feel the game change. I'm gonna be completely honest with you. When I started playing, my line of thinking was the exact same as everyone coming from other action RPGs. I picked the characters that dealt the most damage, made a team of 3 DPS, and assumed the game would solve itself. Spoiler, it didn't work out. I got stuck on bosses, died to regular enemy combos, and couldn't understand why my destructive team wasn't working. The problem is that this game isn't just about big numbers on the screen. It's about how those numbers interact with each other through status ailments. Here is the secret that took me a while to understand. The 5 main ailments, knockdown, shock, freeze, airborne, and bleed, aren't just pretty effects you apply to an enemy. They are puzzle pieces that, when fitted together correctly, multiply your damage in ways no single character could ever achieve on their own. It's a system of cause and effect, where one hero opens the door and another blows everything up. When you stop thinking about who hits harder and start thinking about who opens the window for the next one to strike, the game changes completely. Let me give you a few practical examples that made the light bulb go off for me. Applying shock to an enemy before attempting an airborne or knockdown reduces the application threshold by 30%, meaning you knock the guy down much easier. Freeze, followed by shatter, deals 50% more damage on the first hit that breaks the ice, which is absurd when you pair it with a heavy attack from your burst hero. And then there's Veronica's synergy with bleed. She consumes all bleeding stacks at once for massive damage. So you first apply bleed with one character, build it up, and at the right moment, swap to her and detonate it. This is far more efficient than 3 characters hitting at random. What I learned and what you can test out today is building your team in 3 steps. One hero to apply the effect, another to extend or set up the effect, and a third to detonate it. It doesn't need to be perfect right away, but once you start seeing these chains working in sequence, combat stops being a mess of button mashing and becomes a choreography. If you're still stuck on the idea of a pure damage team, try this for an hour. I bet you won't want to go back. At first, I also thought it was more practical to just stick to my favorite duo and go from there. But the game clearly rewards those who approach fights as a complete sequence rather than a series of loose character swaps. That's where the Orbis cycle makes sense. You start with a hero who applies an ailment, like Renya or Dana, to prep the enemy. Then a launcher comes in, like Alex or Johnny, to change the rhythm of the combo and keep the pressure on. Finally, you close with the burst or utility hero who takes advantage of everything set up before and turns the swap into real damage, control, and advantage. What I like about this idea is that each tag doesn't just serve to change characters. Every entry activates passives and signals, so the rotation becomes a chain of small bonuses that stack up. When I started thinking this way, combat felt much more lively because I stopped waiting for the perfect moment and started building that moment all the time. It feels similar to pulling off a combo that never loses its momentum. If I had to summarize it practically, I'd say this tip is worth it because it forces you to play with intention. Instead of relying on one hero to carry the fight alone, you make all three work together, each fulfilling a step in the sequence. And honestly, that's where DragonSword Awakening starts getting more fun for me, because combat stops feeling like improvisation and becomes a constant pressure that you control. If there's one thing I've learned playing anime ARPGs, it's that games that truly care about combat never hand you everything on a silver platter. DragonSword Awakening is exactly like that. We see the tag combos with status ailments. We read Shock and Airborne in the tutorials. But the game forgets to mention that there's a hidden gauge behind all of it. And that gauge is what separates a player who just presses buttons from a player who masters combat. This is one of those mechanics that seems small on paper, but completely change how you approach every encounter. Here's the magic. When you're hitting an enemy, pay attention to the visual details. If you start noticing electric arcs coming off the target's body, that's not just a pretty effect. It means the shock gauge is nearly full. Similarly, if you notice the enemy showing signs of lighter staggers without that dramatic fall, it's because Airborne is about to trigger. The game doesn't show you a bar, it doesn't give you a number, but the information is right there on the enemy's body for those who know how to look. And that observation is worth its weight in gold in combat. Now comes the part that truly elevates your gameplay. You don't need to, and shouldn't, trigger these effects as soon as the gauge is ready. Use light, weak attacks to gradually fill that hidden bar without triggering the effect. The idea is to keep the enemy on the brink, almost there, and then once your complete combo is ready, you unleash everything. Think of it like loading a weapon before pulling the trigger. You're setting the stage so your burst moment causes maximum damage and maximum crowd control. It's a dance, and you're in control of the tempo. This technique really shines when you're using the game's tag system. Imagine you're using your main character to fill the shock gauge, swap to your partner, apply more pressure with light attacks, and when the enemy is covered in electric arcs, you drop your ultimate or heavy combo. The result is absurd field control and damage that wouldn't have been possible if you triggered the effect on the first heavy hit. DragonSword Awakening rewards those who play with patience and read the battlefield. It's not about skill spamming, it's about timing and awareness. And this tip is especially useful on higher difficulties, where every second of crowd control is worth your team's life. This tip is one of those that completely change the way you play in the endgame, because it's not just about dealing damage, it's about keeping the flow of the fight going at all times. When you cancel animation recovery by swapping heroes at the exact moment the hit connects, you transform a slow action into a much more aggressive and fluid rotation. The most important point here is understanding that many signal skills have a very long ending animation, and that's precisely where many people lose efficiency without realizing it. In practice, the game punishes you less for low damage and more for being stuck waiting for an animation to finish, because that downtime gives the enemy room to breathe, reposition, or break your sequence. I really like this type of mechanic because it separates the player who just uses skills from the player who truly masters combat. When you pull off a clean cancel, your rotation becomes shorter, your control over the target stays consistent, and the fight starts to feel like a well-oiled machine without those awkward pauses that break the flow. So if you're approaching the endgame, I would treat animation canceling as part of your core kit, not an optional advanced trick. At first, it might seem like a minor technical detail, but later you realize it's the kind of tweak that makes the difference between hitting hard and truly dominating the fight the right way. When you enter a fight against an elite or a boss, that white bar isn't there for decoration, it's practically their real defense. If you try to go in with a fancy combo, aerial juggle, or freeze setup before breaking that bar, the chance of taking a counterattack is huge, and honestly, that happens more often than it should. I like to think of it this way. Before trying to launch an enemy into the air or trap them in a stylish sequence, you first need to dismantle their stance. That's where characters like Johnny, Costella, and Othello shine, because they do that job much better. They aren't necessarily the flashiest at the start of the fight, but they are the ones who actually create openings. In practice, this makes combat much safer and more consistent. The most common mistake is getting overly excited about keeping the boss airborne and forgetting they still have active super armor. Then you try to extend a combo, the enemy eats the hit and strikes right back. When that happens, besides losing your rhythm, you also waste resources and your damage window. So if you want to play better, focus on breaking the target's posture first, and only then start the explosive part of the fight. This completely changes how you view combat. Instead of chasing the flashiest combo, you play smarter and turn the fight into something much more controlled. Once the super armor breaks, that's when you bring out the airborne juggles, freeze setups, and everything else that makes the game shine. In the end, it's the difference between just hitting and truly controlling the fight. At first, I saw freeze, shock, and bleed as separate effects, but in DragonSword Awakening, they work almost like fitting puzzle pieces. When you start exploring these elemental reactions and faction synergies, your damage stops being just higher and becomes much smarter. The freeze and shock combination is what catches my attention the most, because Shatter Shock isn't just about dealing a heavy hit, it also spreads shock over a massive area. So you hit one target, break the entire formation, and open up room to maintain pressure. It's the kind of interaction that makes you think, okay, now I get why my team looked good on paper, but only became truly absurd when I stopped using effects in isolation. Faction synergies also seem like a detail many people will ignore at first, only to want to rebuild their entire team later. Running 3 Organa Order heroes, for instance, boosts status ailment application by 15%, which is no small deal in a game where ailments are central to combat. And when you stack that with something like bleed on an airborne enemy for bonus bleed damage, you can feel how the game rewards intentional team building rather than just picking strong characters at random. To me, that's the difference between working and dominating in DragonSword Awakening. A standard team hits hard. A team that leverages these reactions, chains effects, extends vulnerability windows, and turns every swap into a damage multiplier. Honestly, it's exactly this kind of hidden detail that I love most in anime RPGs, because it looks simple on the surface, but gets much deeper once you start experimenting with the right layers. In DragonSword Awakening, perfect dodge and perfect guard aren't just defensive tools, they are the start of your offense. When I realized that in an action RPG, combat changes completely for me, because I stop thinking about avoiding damage and start thinking about creating opportunities. That's when the game becomes much more interesting. Perfect dodge, in particular, feels like an advanced mechanics because it rewards composure. Dodging on the final frame to get that 1-second time freeze while fully filling the switching signal gauge is insanely strong. In practice, this means a perfect defense sets up your entire next offensive turn. It's almost as if the game is saying, you read the attack correctly, so here's a free window to dismantle the enemy. On the other hand, Perfect Guard is a mechanic I like because it conveys a sense of authority. You aren't running from the blow, you're facing it head-on, negating damage, pushing back with pressure, and even inflicting stagger, even on bosses. And when a boss gets locked down for 3 seconds due to clean execution, it doesn't just feel like a solid defense, it feels like punishment. I find that very satisfying because it turns precision into total control over the fight. The main takeaway is understanding that these two techniques aren't just there to save you, they are there to set up free bursts. You nail the timing, freeze the flow of combat, fill your gauge or cause a stagger, and then unleash everything when the enemy can't respond. This is the kind of tip that makes combat look smarter and flashier at the same time. In my view, anyone who learns to use Perfect Dodge and Perfect Guard this way stops improvising and starts dictating the pace of every battle. This tip is one of those that I frankly took a while to appreciate properly. Early on, I treated familiars as exploration bonuses and cooking as a survival gimmick, but in DragonSword Awakening, it goes way beyond that. When you start treating both as core components of combat, managing the game gets easier and much more consistent during tough encounters. High-level familiars aren't just there to look good on your screen. They can extend ailment durations, grant a shield right when you need it most, or even auto-apply status effects, which helps tremendously in keeping up pressure without relying solely on execution. For me, that changes the flow of battle significantly, because you feel like you have an extra layer working in your favor the whole time. As for cooking, it's the kind of feature many players ignore until they hit a progression wall. I get it because it seems minor, but before tackling field giants or high-tier rift floors, a solid food buff makes a tangible difference. I see it as entering the fight with an advantage before the first blow is struck, since you arrive with extra survivability, higher damage, or added safety to handle arena chaos. If I had to summarize the lesson here honestly, it's this. Never treat preparation as over-caution. In a challenging game, every small advantage adds up, and DragonSword Awakening loves rewarding that attention to detail. So I'd step away from the "I'll just jump in and see what happens" mindset and lean into "let me set up my familiar, eat properly, and enter prepared," because it saves a lot of unnecessary frustration. At the start, I wanted to find one fixed team lineup and clear the whole game with it, but combat becomes much easier when you stop forcing the same rotation and start adapting your team to the specific enemy in front of you. The logic is straightforward, and it makes a real difference. Against armored enemies, I prioritize knockdown using Loot, Johnny, or Othello because breaking their defense is the cleanest path to creating an opening. Against flying targets, shock via Renia or Dana tends to be much more efficient. Self-healing enemies call for bleed with Alex, Liza, or Veronica to prevent them from regenerating and wearing you down. And when facing swarms, freeze paired with shatter or area of effect airborne helps control the chaos before the fight spirals out of hand. What I like about this tip is that it shifts your mindset. Instead of asking, which hero do I like most, you start asking, what does this encounter demand right now? Rifts, field giants, and story bosses don't require the same approach, and once you accept that, the game stops feeling unfair and starts feeling readable. It's like switching tools in the middle of a job. It's not a weakness, it's smart play. To me, that's what separates good players from high-level players. Good players clear content. Great players analyze the enemy, build the right lineup, and step in with a ready counter. If you're still sticking to the same team all the time, try adapting. It might feel tedious initially, but once it clicks, you'll feel like you're truly playing DragonSword Awakening rather than just surviving it.